Hey guys, tonight's absolutely thrilling episode is about a period that's frequently painted as a dusty, dull, disease-ridden blur, the Middle Ages. But what if I told you that life back then wasn't just about dodging plagues or getting hacked down on battlefields? Nope. Life was an unending whirlwind of bizarre customs, some truly unhinged societal rules, and secretive pleasures that most history books conveniently ignore. Welcome to 13 shocking revelations about medieval life, hardships, and more. Now you might think, medieval life? Brutal, yes, but also pretty straightforward. Peasants toil, nobles lord, knights joust. Well, think again. Behind the rickety wooden doors of those thatched homes and cold stone castles were stories so twisted, so outright bizarre, they've been scrubbed out of polite history lessons. Today we're peeling back the curtain on medieval social life and pleasures. Because the real cruelty didn't always come from the pike or plague. Sometimes it was the rules of living that made you want to scream into your tunic and maybe run away, preferably very far and fast. From covert liaisons hidden beneath the chaste veil of euphemisms to forbidden knowledge about the human body that would make your doctor today raise an eyebrow or two. Medieval folks had their own complicated dance of desire and distraction. And oh boy, their understanding of intimacy and pleasure. Let's just say the Middle Ages could make modern dating apps seem like a cakewalk. Because behind the sacred altars and stained glass windows, the real action was anything but holy. So why did life feel like an endless episode of what could possibly go wrong every single day? Well, buckle up, because this isn't your average bedtime history story. This is a whirlwind of lusty secrets, gross taboos, and social maneuvering, wrapped in layers of euphemisms that will have you questioning which king or peasant invented the phrase bedroom politics, literally. Let us begin by talking about the medieval approach to matters of the heart, or as late medieval manuals delicately put it, the arts of conjugal congress. You see, while today we openly discuss relationships, back then, conversations about pleasure ran on a strict no-mention, no-show policy. For example, explicitly mentioning certain acts could land you in serious trouble, both socially and legally. So people took to veil their personal dealings with poetic euphemisms like the marital debt, earning a penny, or visiting the inner chamber. Sounds innocent enough, until you realize it was code for things their neighbors definitely didn't want to imagine. Now, if you think clandestine rendezvous were limited to royalty ogling through castle windows, think again. The medieval period was practically swimming with covert liaisons, involving everyone from knights and nobles to merchants and peasants. Take the infamous scandal of King Edward II of England in the early 1300s. His relationships with certain favorites, euphemistically dubbed his close companions, sparked enough rumors and rebellions, because his affections strayed far from conventional marriage contracts, which was a brilliant decision-making moment, because causing political chaos by your love life? What could possibly go wrong, right? And while royalty's secret romances fueled intrigues that shaped kingdoms, ordinary folk had their own underground pleasures and secrets. For example, did you know medieval towns often had places known as pleasure gardens? No, these weren't your grandma's botanical havens for meditation. These spots frequently doubled as rendezvous points for, shall we say, working women, though medieval euphemisms preferred terms like soiled doves or gardeners who tended a different kind of bed. Despite the church's relentless crackdown, these activities thrived in whispered shadows, proving that human nature doesn't always read the rule book. But what about knowledge of the body? You might imagine medieval doctors as stern, gloomy figures doling out leeches and prayers, which isn't entirely wrong. Yet behind their grimy textbooks were surprising revelations about how sexuality and health intertwined, tangled in a stew of superstition, religion, and emerging science. For instance, medieval sex manuals like the infamous Trotula circulated widely, not just offering advice on pleasure, but also bizarre warnings that certain sexual acts could result in demons invading your body. Demon possession, really. It was a neat way to keep people in line, behave in the bedroom, or evil spirits might RSVP uninvited. But wait, there's more disturbing evidence about medieval social life. How about the fact that some marriages were essentially business contracts where consummating wasn't just an act of love, but a legal obligation. If the couple failed to meet these duties, annulments could be sought, sometimes dragging the scandalous details of bedroom behavior into the public square. So not only was your sex life a private affair, but it was potentially a public trial. Talk about pressure to perform and stay out of trouble. Imagine that awkward town gossip, amplified by accusations of failing the marital debt. Now, if you think maybe medieval pleasure was reserved only for the men, think again. Women had their own complex relationships with pleasure, often entangled in contradictions. On one hand, church teachings generally painted female desire as dangerous and sinful, but on the other, including in their own writings, medieval women sometimes sought and relished intimate knowledge, sharing secret remedies and advice on female comfort. It wasn't all forbidden fruit. There was a thriving underground heartbeat of female empowerment, even if it was tightly tangled in layers of taboo and danger. Speaking of danger, let's touch on an oddly fascinating subject: medieval contraceptives. Yes, believe it or not, there were attempts at birth control long before modern pills and devices. Herbal remedies, potions, and even bizarre amulets were employed to stifle fertility. Some of these methods were incredibly risky, like inserting dried herbs into the uterus or drinking toxic concoctions. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and medieval couples, just like us, wanted to avoid unexpected family expansion. Of course, the church heavily frowned upon this, cheating the natural order, labeling such acts heretical or sinful, because who doesn't want to complicate basic biology with layers of religious guilt? And then there was courtly love, the medieval invention that would make every modern dating coach blush or cringe. Unlike the straightforward marriages for property or alliance, courtly love was all about the thrill of longing from afar. Secret poems, wrapped gifts, and barely concealed crushes on unattainable noblewomen. It's basically medieval catfishing, but without the internet. Yet underneath the romantic gloss lay a socially accepted outlet for sexual frustration and expression. Think of it as the original friends with benefits situation, minus the benefits and with a lot more dramatic poetry. But it wasn't just nobles playing this game. Folk songs, tales, and even church sermons often contained veiled references to forbidden desires and hidden flames burning behind the social facade. So while public life was about piety and appearances, private life was a stew of secret pleasures, taboos, and often dangerous liaisons that kept the spark alive in a world that otherwise wanted to snuff it out. Of course, no discussion on medieval sexual life would be complete without naming the elephant in the room, the infamous bawdy tales and the role of taverns in social lubricating. Medieval taverns were not just places to drown your sorrows, but hubs where innkeepers doubled as matchmakers or facilitators for encounters that were officially frowned upon but unofficially well tolerated. From whispered exchanges behind barrels of mead to the late-night visits of various trained comfort providers, these establishments stood as front-line battlegrounds in the war between social order and human instincts. And if we think modern-day scandals are bad, the penalties for crossing moral lines in the Middle Ages were downright medieval in the worst sense. Public shaming, whipping posts, or worse. For example, women accused of inappropriate behavior risked being branded, forced into repentance, or expelled altogether. The church and secular courts were constantly on the lookout to stamp out deviant behavior, which, considering how human desire works, was an excellent way to ensure no one ever just peacefully enjoyed their private life. So, sitting here in our comfy chairs, it's tempting to laugh or scoff at these medieval pleasure trials, but really, it's a bit of a horror show once you dig deeper. Your love life, your health, your reputation, all intertwined, existing within a framework where curiosity often ended in punishment and secrecy, was mandatory for survival. And the strangest part? Some of these clandestine pleasures and societal follies set the stage for the Renaissance and modern views on relationships and sexuality. A twisted legacy passed down through the ages, born in the shadowy bedrooms and stolen glances of the Middle Ages. But if you think medieval secret pleasures and social rituals were the height of dark absurdity, what we're about to explore next will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about that era. Speaking of which, let's dive into the brutal reality, the violence that so unapologetically ruled medieval days, shaping society in blood and bone. Because when it comes to living with constant threats, medieval folks didn't just wrestle with passion and privacy. They wrestled with the brutal claws of warfare, punishments, and rituals that still haunt our imagination today. Now that we've peeled back the tangled web of medieval bedroom escapades, those clever little nocturnal negotiations wrapped in euphemisms and whispers, let us dive headlong into the blood-stained battlefield and the public square where violence thrived like an unwanted houseguest that simply wouldn't leave. Life in the Middle Ages wasn't just a series of secret flings and coded sensual pleasures. It was also a relentless carnival of brutality, where warfare, punishment, and shockingly messy rituals were the background score to daily existence. This wasn't some distant, sanitized epic. It was a reality that made even the most hardened modern crime scene look like a tea party with grandma. Think about it. While our covert lovers were sneaking kisses and swapping shady smiles under the cloak of religious piety and societal judgment, out the window roared the unmistakable soundtrack of grinding metal cracking bones and the wet slap of human misery. But wait. There's more disturbing evidence this was no mere sideshow. Violence was woven into the very fabric of medieval society. Kings didn't just wax poetic about courtly love. They also sanctioned wars so savage they make today's politicians look like choir boys. Medieval punishments? Imagine walking through a nightmare designed by a particularly sadistic board of safety commissioners, then multiply that by 10. And the rituals, a mix of pagan hysteria and church zealotry, were grotesque theatrical productions that left spectators cheering for the blood. To put this into context, consider the 14th century, say around 1346, when Edward III of England led his troops to the Battle of Crécy. This wasn't a polite game of let us see who has the sharpest sword. It was an orgy of violence where thousands perished, and the longbow wielded by English archers shredded French knights off their horses like rag dolls. Chroniclers like Froissart didn't hold back on describing the carnage. Horses trampled bodies, the ground was slick with blood, and victory smelled more like iron than glory. Medieval warfare wasn't a chessboard. It was a blood-stained butcher's stall. But warfare wasn't the only stage for medieval bloodlust. Public punishments were the official Netflix of the day, only with more screams and less buffering. If you thought getting a speeding ticket is harsh, try being the criminal who faced the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, a device designed explicitly to make you question every life choice that led you there. The accused would be lashed or have their limbs crushed by iron bars, all while the crowd feasted their eyes on this human jigsaw puzzle. Tacitus, a historian whose opinions carry the weight of authority, wrote of such spectacles carefully orchestrated to instill a wholesome fear of law-breaking. The message was loud and clear: misstep, and your death won't be quick or polite. It'll be a slow, excruciating exhibit. Interestingly, these dreadful rituals indicate an insatiable societal appetite for violence as public entertainment. Feasts, fairs, and market days often doubled as opportunities not just to barter goods, but to witness the state-sanctioned dismemberment of lawbreakers. This public spectacle was not merely about punishment, it was a bloody form of social control. Meanwhile, at the hands of nobility, violence took on another form. Court intrigue wasn't settled with words, but with poison, conspiracies, and well-placed daggers. The ruthless Machiavellian dances of power were practiced long before Machiavelli put quill to parchment. And let's not forget the rampant feuding families who waged their wars like medieval gangsters, paying blood debts and swapping heads like they were baseball cards. Here's a little-known gem for you. In the early 13th century, the German city of Cologne hosted a peculiar punishment ritual known as the Blood Court. According to the chronicler Helmut of Bossau, thieves and bandits weren't just imprisoned or fined. They were forced to fight wild animals right in the city square, sometimes to the death. Talk about a public relations disaster if one of these combatants chomped an official instead. As if battling wild beasts wasn't horrifying enough, medieval man believed violence had a supernatural dimension. Ritualistic cruelty, such as the ceremonial torturing of effigies or symbolic scapegoats, was thought to cleanse communities of sin and evil spirits. The infamous flagellants movement of the 14th century epitomized this belief. Groups of penitents would whip themselves mercilessly in public streets, convinced their bloodshed would protect them from the ravages of the Black Death. This wasn't just self-punishment. It was systemic violence cloaked in pious fervor, and it often incited mob violence against vulnerable minorities blamed for attracting divine wrath. Religious zeal and bloodlust, a deadly cocktail that brewed centuries of misery. While our earlier segment showed how intimate lives were a tangle of coded messages and forbidden liaisons, the public sphere was a gladiatorial arena soaked in actual blood and gore. And the violence didn't limit itself to the obvious. In the domestic sphere, arguments might escalate to the extent the medieval justice system had a field day deciding who got chopped, hanged, or burned. Suetonius, though a Roman writer, starkly contrasts these periods when he critiques excesses of power, but the Middle Ages took it to a whole different level. Justice was less about fairness and more about spectacle. Let's discuss the infamous execution method of hanging, drawing, and quartering in England from the late 13th century onward. It was the ultimate triple-threat punishment reserved for traitors rather than your garden-variety thief. The condemned would first be drawn to the execution site, dragged behind a horse, then hanged nearly to death, disemboweled, and finally, their bodies cut into 4 parts and displayed as a warning to others. Charming hospitality, isn't it? This spectacularly gruesome ritual reflected a government's determination to instill fear while entertaining its populace, a distorted combination no modern-day leader would openly advertise. What could possibly go wrong? But violence was not just a tool for the state, it was also a social equalizer. Peasant uprisings like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 showcased how ordinary people wielded violence as a direct response to unbearable hardship. The revolt wasn't your standard rebellion. It was a chaotic whirlwind of revenge, destruction, and raw anger. Richard II, a mere boy of 14, found his throne challenged by a mob that executed unpopular officials and tore down symbols of feudal oppression. The medieval world's constant cycle of violence wasn't limited to wars between armies, but permeated everyday life and class struggles. The brutality of medieval warfare extended beyond the battlefield's immediate haze into sieges where starvation, disease, and psychological torture joined the ranks of axes and arrows. Take the Siege of Orleans in 1429, Joan of Arc's legendary crusade, where combatants endured months of relentless brutality and civilians faced starvation and massacres. Sieges were medieval versions of burn it all down and see who comes crawling. and they often ended with mass executions or forced expulsions, further intensifying the violence embedded in daily life. And if you think medieval punishment was all about making victims suffer physically, think again. Economic violence was a favorite tool for rulers and landlords. Fines, forced labor, and confiscations were routine instruments of control designed to keep the peasantry in line through fiscal despair. A reference to this is found in numerous charters and manorial records that list penalties for everything from poaching to being rudely frank with a Lord S. Steward. These could land a person in debtor's prison or force years of unpaid labor. A slow violence just as deadly as a sword blow. What about violence towards women, an oft overlooked domain in mainstream medieval histories? Far from the romanticized tales of courtly love, many medieval women endured domestic violence, public shaming, and even death for stepping outside prescribed roles. Accusations of witchcraft, often a veiled excuse for punishing women seen as threats to the patriarchal order, led to torture and execution. The infamous witch trials, especially from the late medieval period into early modernity, demonstrated how misogyny weaponized violence under the guise of community protection. Pliny the Elder's reflections on the darker aspects of society find a grim echo here, where superstition and violence fused in deadly combination. Brutality also shaped medieval justice through the use of trials by ordeal theatrical tests of innocence that involved, for example, holding hot iron or submerging a hand in boiling water. If you didn't a blister just right, congratulations, you were probably wicked. This brilliant decision-making process was less about evidence and more about terrifying rituals designed to bolster church authority and social order. What could possibly go wrong? Apart from formal punishment, violence seeped into everyday disputes played out over land, livestock, or honor. Sword fights and brawls weren't uncommon even in market towns. The chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth records numerous duels and skirmishes among minor nobles, who settled arguments by swords instead of spreadsheets. This gentlemanly violence reinforced status and power, but also kept the body count high. If you wanted peace, you'd better hope you weren't standing between a medieval noble and his ego. Interestingly, the very architecture of towns and castles reflected a society steeped in violence. Moats, battlements, murder holes, and arrow slits weren't just ornate embellishments. They were reminders that the threat of violence was perpetual. People slept every night knowing their home could become a fortress or a prison. An intimate relationship with death and blood was, frankly, unescapable. Finally, we must consider the psychological toll. Chronic exposure to such relentless violence undoubtedly affected medieval minds. The absurd frequency of brutality bred a culture desensitized to human suffering. Literary works from the era, such as the gruesome chronicles of Geoffrey Chaucer or the grim tales of the Decameron, mirror a society coping with horror through dark humor and satire. It's sometimes as if the people were collectively saying, well, if we can't stop the bloodshed, we might as well laugh at it. As we scale the ladder of medieval violence from battlefield butchery to the terrifying rituals of justice and social control, a pattern emerges. Violence wasn't a bizarre aberration, but a normalized, even celebrated part of life. And the common folk, noble lords and clerics alike, were players in this bloody theater, balancing fragile power with cruelty. Yet the story doesn't end here. Medieval life's hardships weren't just about who stabbed whom or who was thrown into a pit. No, dear listener, what comes next is a dive into the truly bizarre, the strange customs, hygiene horrors, and diet disasters that made everyday survival feel like a waking nightmare. Speaking of systematic violence, the bizarre ceremonies we're about to uncover will make assassination look like child's play. Stick around. The Middle Ages weirdness parade is just getting started. The blood and bone of medieval violence we just peeled back was brutal, systematic, and lacked even the faintest hint of modern decency. But if you thought the Middle Ages were all about swinging swords, brutal executions, and political assassinations that make today's politicians look like choir boys, prepare for a detour into the realm of bizarre everyday customs that define just how twisted daily existence could be. Because medieval life wasn't just about getting stabbed, tortured, or publicly humiliated. No, the common folk and nobility alike lived under the shadow of customs so weird and riddled with superstition that you'd wonder if they were trying to invent suffering on purpose. Oddities that make you question if hygiene was just a rumor, diet a cruel joke, and superstition a full-time job. Let's start with something both basic and horrifying: personal hygiene. It's almost laughable to think about today, but medieval cleanliness was a disaster wrapped in the fog of ignorance. Baths were not the routine relaxation you might imagine. Instead, bathing was a rare event, sometimes reserved for yearly occasions or specific festivals, and often a source of anxiety rather than comfort. Why? Because water was believed to not only open the pores, but also welcome in all sorts of evil spirits and illnesses. Yes, that's right. People feared that getting too clean would invite diseases in through their open skin. Brilliant decision-making. This meant most people smelled like they lost a fight with a cesspit, which might explain medieval Europe's reputation for stench even centuries later. Clothes were washed even less frequently, just swapped out when they could no longer stand the smell. Not because of fashion trends, but because laundry was an awful affair involving heavy manual labor and scarce resources. Pliny the Elder, way before the Middle Ages, warned that water could open the body to illness. Medieval physicians and monks who passed down medical knowledge echoed similar thoughts. Hygiene for health was basically a myth, and don't think the nobles were exempt. Figures like King Henry VIII preferred sweet-smelling perfumes and aromatic gloves to cover the odor of their bodies, a kind of medieval deodorant workaround. On the bright side, the use of spices for masking stench in food and on skin did drive up international trade profits, so silver lining. Now on to diet, because nothing says starvation and misery like medieval meals. The typical peasant daily fare was a thick gruel made from barley or rye, occasionally supplemented by cabbage or wild herbs when they were lucky. Meat was as rare as personal hygiene, often reserved for celebrations or the lucky few nobles who didn't want their servants eating all the good stuff. Food scarcity was common, which means the Middle Ages had a rich tradition of cannibalistic rumors. Not exactly the picnic you hoped for. Add in superstitions around food, and you've got a fine recipe for misery. Certain foods were believed to carry magical or physical properties. For example, garlic wasn't just for flavor. It was a ward against evil spirits and the plague, which made culinary choices tightly intertwined with fear. The concept of numen's humors now carried over from Galen's ancient medical theories meant that foods were categorized as hot, cold, wet, or dry, and eating the wrong combination might make you sick or mad. Think of medieval diet charts as a bizarre game of roulette, with death lurking beneath every forkful. What's more, table manners were a mix of ritual and survival. Sharing utensils was almost unheard of, likely a wise move given rampant disease, but that also meant you'd often eat with your hands, dipping bread into communal dishes, which only spread germs faster. The treacheries of medieval cuisine don't end there. Consider the disgusting delicacies reserved for the elite: swan, peacock, and even nightingale tongues. Yes, tongues. Imagine the mental gymnastics needed to convince yourself eating the severed tongue of a songbird was a regular dinner option. But wait, there's more disturbing evidence in the rituals of cleanliness and bodily care. Medieval people developed some truly odd practices to handle what they saw as dingy and dangerous human bodies. For instance, urine was not only a means of bodily waste disposal, but also a medical currency of sorts. Physicians assessed urine color and smell to diagnose patients, a practice called uroscopy, and it wasn't just passive observation. They sometimes prescribed treatments involving the application or even ingestion of urine. Tacitus, the Roman historian whose influence lingered into medieval thought, described these medical rites without even a hint of irony. Medieval folk probably thought this was cutting-edge science. Then there were the bizarre uses of animals in daily life, not just as food but ritual props. Cats were wild cards. In some towns they were revered for their pest control, in others feared as witches' familiars and exterminated en masse, ironically leading to increased rat populations and, ultimately, worse plague outbreaks. The black cat superstition wasn't just folklore, it was a self-fulfilling disaster in epidemiology. Ravens and crows, too, had symbolic significance, but some thought that feeding or watching their movements could ward off evil or summon doom, depending on regional tradition. When your best pest control is a black cat that could also land you burnt at the stake, you know you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Superstition extended deeply into daily routines. Consider the evil eye, a belief so widespread that every household protected themselves with charms, amulets or hanging herbs like rosemary and rue to repel malevolent glances. The church tried to moderate some of these superstitions, but even priests carried their own bag of charms. Prayers recited over supposed magical stones or relics to cure illnesses. Baptismal water, holy relics and pilgrimages served as remedies and protections, not unlike medieval insurance policies bought with faith and fear. The irony? These rituals often replaced effective hygiene or medical treatment, worsening suffering and mortality. Food preparation itself was loaded with lore. Salt, for example, was a prized commodity not only for flavor and preservation, but also believed to have purifying powers. It was sprinkled to repel witches and evil spirits, like some kind of medieval garlic salt defense. In England, adding salt to a newborn's mouth was a common protective rite. But too much salt, that was another misfortune on the horizon. When famine struck and salt was scarce, food spoiled quickly, and starvation or worse poisoning loomed large. Now, setting the stage for the truly bizarre, fear of the supernatural was woven into countless customs. One that survived from pagan roots was the mummers' play, performed at Christmas or certain festivals. Characters like the hobby horse or the wild man wore grotesque costumes and masks, engaging in violent mock battles that acted as symbolic reenactments of life, death, and seasonal rebirth. But these rituals were not just entertainment. They were believed to influence real-world outcomes like crop fertility or protect the village from evil. Performance was part exorcism, part pagan sacrifice, but entirely bizarre to us today. And if that sounds strange, medieval weddings and funerals were no less odd. Funerals involved elaborate rituals to confuse the dead and prevent them from returning as restless spirits or demons. In 14th century England, it was common to place coins under the tongues of corpses, ostensibly to pay Charon, the ferryman of the dead. Yet the church simultaneously condemned this as pagan superstition. Yet within the same breath, Christian burials included exorcisms and prayers to keep evil at bay, blending the sacred and the superstitious in equal parts. For weddings, because marriage was a contract more than a love story, sometimes bizarre customs appeared, like the ritual insertion of lucky charms or bizarre dances that looked more like exorcisms than celebrations. Let's also not overlook the personal grooming practices, or the lack thereof, which crossed superstitions and ignorance with outright neglect. Barber surgeons wielded razors with enthusiasm, but little hygiene. Bloodletting, a practice carried out to balance humors, was accompanied by haircuts or tooth extractions, an all-in-one medieval spa treatment if you could survive it. The smell in those barber shops must have been unbearable, a pungent mix of blood, sweat-soaked wool, and unwashed scalps. Somehow these were considered places of health and rejuvenation. Speaking of health, the medieval obsession with bodily fluids went beyond uroscopy. They believed that illnesses were caused by imbalances of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. This pseudoscientific belief guided medical treatments that involved purging, vomiting, and copious bleeding, practices that often killed patients faster than the disease. The psychological strain on people helpless under these medical rituals deserves mention. Imagine living in an age where your doctor cuts your veins open and hopes you don't bleed out, all based on the idea that your personality had turned sour. All these bizarre customs, bodily, dietary, spiritual, formed a tightly woven web of medieval misery, where suffering was ritualized, medical care was often just elaborate guessing, and superstition dictated everyday behavior. With such insanity baked deep into the culture, it's no surprise that the Middle Ages were an era where survival wasn't just about courage, but navigating puzzling and frightening traditions that seemed designed to sap the soul. Understanding these oddities in hygiene, diet, and superstition is crucial because they set the stage for what's arguably the peak of medieval madness: the rise of pseudoscience healing and harming, the alchemists. herbalists and quacks who promised salvation but usually delivered torment. The medieval mad science of quack doctors, potions brewed from poisonous plants, and terrible surgeries carried out under the guise of knowledge were the natural consequence of a world where bizarre customs met desperate needs. So as we prepare to dive into the final stretch of this descent into medieval darkness, keep in mind that every ritual, every strange habit, every fearful superstition was less about progress and more about survival through fear, ignorance, and an astounding tolerance for pain, physical, mental, and spiritual. And if you thought those rituals were the height of medieval madness, wait until you meet the quacks, alchemists, and herbalists who provided intellectual justification for all of this insanity. The bizarre rituals and superstitious hygiene practices we just uncovered make it painfully clear. The Middle Ages were not the shining beacon of rationality and progress one might nostalgically imagine. Bathing less often than a modern houseplant, treating leprosy by dunking in holy water, or relying on bloodletting because someone once thought veins were filled with something other than blood, these weren't just eccentric quirks. They were symptoms of a complete misunderstanding of how the world's plumbing, much less the human body, actually worked. But if you thought medieval medicine was merely quacks dunking people in ponds, brace yourself. The dark art of pseudoscience in those times was an elaborate theater of hope, fear, and financial ruin. Welcome to the thrilling world of medieval mad science, where alchemy wasn't just a mystical pastime, but a serious contender in the race to cure everything from gout to vampirism. By around the 12th century, Europe had become a battleground for knowledge waged between stubborn superstition and the faintest glimmers of natural philosophy. Monasteries, often the only centers of education, painstakingly copied texts from ancient Greek and Roman authorities, Galen, Hippocrates, Dioscorides, whose works, though brilliant in their time, were frequently misunderstood or misapplied. Physicians and apothecaries prided themselves on their access to these classical secrets. Yet frequently, their scientific methods blended empirical observation with ritual, folklore, and elaborate guesswork that makes today's wellness industry look like a well-oiled machine. At the heart of medieval medicine was the enduring theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Balancing these bodily fluids dictated health. An excess or deficiency meant illness. Unfortunately, the treatments offered were often far more aggressive than helpful. Bloodletting, the favourite pastime of doctors from Paris to Palermo, was intended to restore balance, and it was so widely practiced that some historians estimate medieval physicians performed it more than 1 million times a year across Europe. Bloodletting was carried out using leeches, lancets, or even winged bleeding cups that would suck out the life force, or at least a cup of your life's fluids, with admirable consistency. But who made these medical decisions? Enter the learned quacks and alchemists, those curators of ancient wisdom and dubious potions. Figures like Theodoric Borgognoni, a 13th century surgeon who, surprisingly, rejected rampant bloodletting in favor of cleanliness and suturing wounds, a practice closer to modern medicine than his peers, were rare. Meanwhile, most doctors dutifully followed Galenic precepts, mixing spider webs with wine or pulverized bones with honey, convinced they had either a cure or a potent poison. What could possibly go wrong? Meanwhile, the household apothecary was a master of herbalism, an arena where natural science and superstition became indistinguishable. Plants like mandrake and belladonna were prized for their mysterious properties, often used to induce trance-like states or drive out evil spirits. The mandrake root, with its humanoid shape, was as treasured as it was feared. According to tradition, pulling it from the ground would release a deadly scream, killing the unfortunate harvester, adding a level of danger that modern pharmaceuticals simply lack. Need a love potion? Press a poisonous leaf into a creepy concoction and wait for some poor soul to swoon, or end up unconscious in a ditch. Alchemy's role in medieval science can hardly be overstated, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries. Often viewed as a mad quest to turn lead into gold, this pseudoscience bore a sinister side. It promised eternal youth, miraculous cures, and universal remedies, enticing noble patrons to fund lavish laboratories filled with vials of glowing liquids and suspicious powders. The famous Nicolas Flamel, a Parisian scribe from the late 1300s, became legendary not for scrupulous scholarship, but for the supposed discovery of the philosopher's stone, a magical substance said to grant immortality and enrich your coffers immensely. His actual scientific contribution, convincing gullible aristocrats to supply him with gold, wine, and babes for his exploding beakers. Of course, no discussion of medieval pseudoscience is complete without mentioning the role of oracles and diviners. The Church officially condemned pagan practices, but the line between legitimate religious ritual and forbidden occult knowledge was often blurred. Prophecies delivered by the likes of Joachim of Fiore in the 12th century intertwined with medicinal recommendations. Astrology, for example, was a serious science. Physicians checked star charts before prescribing treatments, convinced that the heavens dictated illness and recovery. If your horoscope suggested an excess of black bile causing melancholy, it was only logical to imbibe a concoction brewed under a waxing moon while chanting obscure prayers. Sounds foolproof, right? The intellectual roots of these beliefs can be traced back to the uneasy marriage of classical antiquity and early Christian theology, where natural philosophy was both revered and restricted. Galen's anatomical works, rediscovered and translated in the 12th century from Arabic texts, were treated as canonical scripture, but rarely questioned, despite his acute mistakes, like the belief that the liver, not the heart, was the seat of blood production. The Church provided a framework where science could flourish only when it aligned with Scripture, creating fertile soil for half-truths and alchemical fantasies to blossom. Clergy often doubled as controversial healers and scientists, with monasteries functioning like proto-research centers full of herbal gardens, crucibles, and scribes recording every experiment, whether successful or catastrophic. Backing up these scholarly delusions was a psychological cocktail of ignorance, anxiety, and desperate hope. Carl Jung might have called it a collective shadow projected onto the body and spirit, except medieval peasants and nobles alike simply called it Tuesday. The blurring of boundaries between medicine, magic, and religion catered to human fears and needs. The terror of death, the hope for salvation, and the ever-pressing desire for profit. The intellectual corruption inherent in medieval medicine is clear when we realize that credible scientific breakthroughs were often buried under centuries of superstition, trial, and error, or worse, deliberate fraud. Turning to specific cases, one could examine the life and times of Paracelsus, the enigmatic 16th century Swiss physician and alchemist who stood at the boundary where medieval ignorance spilled into Renaissance enlightenment. Paracelsus lambasted his contemporaries for relying on outdated texts and superstition, advocating instead for chemical remedies and the concept of dose-dependent toxicity, a revolutionary idea that poison can be a medicine in the right quantity. Yet even he entertained notions of elemental spirits and mystical forces. His remedies combined arsenic, mercury, and sulfur with mystical incantations, a cocktail both dangerous and weirdly ahead of his time. But wait, there's more disturbing evidence. The infamous medieval plague doctors, easily recognizable with their eerie beaked masks stuffed with fragrant herbs, were not just costume oddities. These masks were designed based on the miasma theory, that diseases spread through evil vapors in the air, a theory so imaginative it makes today's flat earth proponents seem sober. The masks held lavender, mint, and other perfumed herbs to purify the air the doctor breathed. Unsurprisingly, their treatments, bloodletting, administering toxic compounds like mercury, or applying heated cauterization, did little to help. Plague treatments often seemed designed to terrify patients into compliance, or serve as convenient scapegoats when the bubonic death toll soared. Further illustrating medieval medical mishaps were surgical procedures that operated literally in the Dark Ages. Without anesthesia beyond a splash of wine or a swift kick, barbers doubled as surgeons, performing amputations, trepanations, drilling skull holes to release spirits, and tooth extractions with ruthless efficiency. Ambroise Paré, a 16th century French barber surgeon, eventually pioneered wound treatment with ligatures instead of cauterization, but only after centuries of medieval masochism masquerading as healing. The pseudo-scientific chaos even permeated everyday items. For example, the ubiquitous theriac was a cure-all concoction that could contain opium, snake meat, and ground pearls, all mixed into a dense syrup that promised relief from everything from the plague to melancholy. Theriac's recipe varied wildly, but gained a reputation akin to snake oil mixed with owl hoots and promises. It was used by kings and peasants alike because, well, when your options range from poison to prayer, why not try a little of each? Drawing parallels to modern times, one might smile at how the wellness industry exploits similar blends of tradition and pseudoscience. Detox teas filled with unpronounceable herbs, miracle elixirs promising eternal youth, or expensive crystals charged with energies echo medieval alchemists selling hope in a bottle. The conspiracy theories proliferating on social media about vaccine side effects or natural cures for diseases recall the desperate faith medieval people placed in oracles and apothecaries. In many ways, the dance of ignorance and hope across centuries remains eerily consistent, even if today as charlatans favor Instagram and flashy branding rather than dusty tomes. In terms of religious implications, the intertwining of science with Christian dogma fostered a cautious skepticism toward innovation. While the Church preserved knowledge, it also wielded power over its interpretation. Heretical ideas, especially those that challenged humoral theory or the sacred balance, were suppressed. This alliance of institution and ignorance ensured that progress was measured in millennia rather than decades, underscoring the tragedy beneath the surface of medieval wisdom. So where does that leave us? With a landscape full of quacks claiming divine insight and alchemists chasing immortality, medieval medicine was a high-stakes lottery run on ancient texts, superstition, and the occasional lucky guess. Doctors who wielded scissors and knives were just as likely to bleed patients to death as heal them, and herbalists brewed potions that were either calming, intoxicating, or downright poisonous. Combined with the Church's gatekeeping over acceptable knowledge, the Middle Ages represent a poignant chapter where science masqueraded as magic, and magic dared to call itself science. As we prepare to wrap up this odyssey through medieval hardship, think back on the bizarre customs, the filthy living conditions, and the endless fears of yesterday's peasants and princes. They were trapped not just by poverty, plague, and violence, but by a profoundly flawed understanding of their own bodies and the universe. Pseudoscientific beliefs weren't just quaint footnotes. They were pillars holding up a crumbling edifice of ignorance that dictated every facet of life and death. And now, as we approach the final conclusion, it is clear this journey has taken us through the worst of medieval existence, from the shadowy alleyways of forbidden liaisons and bizarre daily customs to the gory spectacles of torture and ritual, and finally to the cracked and dusty laboratories where mad science reigned supreme. Soon we will confront how all these elements combine to forge an epoch defined by suffering, deception, and the desperate human will to endure. Prepare for the final reckoning, because understanding this chaotic blend of brutality and belief challenges our assumptions about progress and civilization itself. It forces uncomfortable questions. How far have we truly come? And what dark corners of our own modern world might still harbor the echoes of medieval madness? So stay tuned as we unravel the tangled web of history's enduring mysteries, threading the lessons from the past into the fabric of our present and future. The conclusion awaits. So there you have it, your absolutely thrilling journey through boring old history, the Middle Ages. We've unraveled 4 pillars of medieval corruption and misery that, when combined, created a blueprint for how societies can strangle themselves from the inside out. The clandestine, euphemism-laced labyrinth of medieval sexuality and social mores. The relentless, unapologetic torrent of violence that stained every corner of public and private life. The grotesquely bizarre customs and superstitions that dictated hygiene, diet, and ritual. And the mad science of alchemy and pseudo-medicine that promised salvation yet delivered suffering. But these weren't isolated curiosities. They were interconnected gears in a grim machine, each reinforcing the other, creating a system where corruption and cruelty thrived. Take, for instance, the way medieval sexual codes, the marital debt, the pleasure gardens, and whispered arts of conjugal congress weren't just about bedroom politics but about power projection. The scandal of King Edward II's close companions wasn't merely gossip, it was a political crisis, where personal desires directly threatened the delicate balance of royal authority. The social necessity of secrecy, the clouding of desire with euphemism and fear, created a psychological cage. People weren't just hiding their pleasures, they were internalizing shame and anxiety, building a climate ripe for manipulation. One could hardly imagine a more effective way to keep a populace obedient than convincing half of them that their own longing was sinful or demonic. Meanwhile, that same culture accepted, normalized, and even glorified naked brutality. The Battle of Crécy wasn't just a historical footnote, it was a stark illustration of medieval power, the capacity to orchestrate death on a scale that would make modern mass shootings look like preschool scrapbooks, and public punishments, like the breaking wheel and hanging, drawing, and quartering, weren't designed simply to punish but to entertain, to terrorize, to coagulate social control in a spectacle of blood and screams. The copious cruelty was not an anomaly, but the baseline texture of life. When the church-sanctioned flagellants whipped themselves to stave off the plague, violence bled into religion itself, transforming pain into a ritualized communal delusion. The psychological pattern here? Power feeds on fear and spectacle. Brutality becomes a tool to both distract and dominate. These two domains, sexual repression and public violence, combined with the third pillar, the bizarre customs and superstitions that shaped everyday existence. Imagine a society where bathing was feared as an invitation to disease, where black cats could either save your crops or condemn you to the pyre, where body fluids were diagnostic tools and protective amulets hung in every doorway. Hygiene, diet, and rituals were mired in fear and contradictory beliefs, shaped by the invisible hand of superstition that permeated every household. The psychological function was to create order in chaos, control in uncertainty, but it ultimately fostered ignorance and suffering. This web of rituals also created economic and social dependencies. For example, nobles replacing proper hygiene with perfumes, thus fueling sprawling trade and inequality as they masked the misery of the many. And then, finally, the alchemists, the quacks, the pseudo-scientists. They were the icing on this medieval cake of madness. The science of the era wasn't a quest for truth, but a theater of hope, fear, and profit. Bloodletting was less a remedy and more a ritual sacrifice to the gods of ignorance. Astrology dictated treatment plans, and miraculous elixirs mixed ground pearls with snake meat, selling salvation in bottles to the desperate and the naive. Here again, the psychological architecture was clear. A population traumatized by death, disease, and oppression grasped at every straw offered by those willing to peddle fantastical cures, often with ecclesiastical blessing or at least acquiescence. The marriage of ignorance and authority ensured that this system perpetuated itself, embedding corruption into the very fabric of knowledge. Why do these four taboo themes always appear together in corrupt systems? Because they are mutually reinforcing. Social repression feeds fear, which fuels acceptance of violence. Violence creates a climate where bizarre customs flourish as coping mechanisms, and ignorance, in service of power, allows pseudo-knowledge to masquerade as truth. The Middle Ages stand as a testament to this poisonous feedback loop, where power corrupts not just individuals, but entire societies by weaponizing fear, secrecy, spectacle, and false knowledge. If that pattern sounds familiar, well, that's because it isn't ancient history. Fast forward to today, and Donati tell me you don't hear echoes of medieval shadows in modern political scandals that hinge on secret liaisons and euphemisms, where the private misdeeds of leaders explode into public crises. Think of Watergate, or more recent sex scandals where the code of silence preserves power, while whispers and half-truths cloud the public eye. The same psychological mechanisms are at play: a fear of exposure, the elite's hypocrisy, and the public's insatiable appetite for scandal. And the violent thread? Authoritarian regimes worldwide still wield brutality, both physical and psychological, as a weapon. Public spectacles of punishment and fear might not involve breaking wheels anymore, but mass incarcerations, forced disappearances, and state-sponsored violence reinforce the same societal control medieval rulers once practiced so openly. As in the Middle Ages, violence dressed in legality functions as theatre, designed less to enforce justice and more to maintain dominance. Then the cult-like behaviors we saw in medieval superstition have very modern cousins. Think of internet echo chambers, wellness cults and conspiracy theory fringe groups, all modern rituals born of fear and alienation, wrapped in pseudoscience and hypnotic dogma. The medieval alchemists selling snake oil find their heirs in influencers peddling detox teas or magical crystals, promising healing or enlightenment while often preying on the vulnerable. The psychology of hope and fear remains unchanged. It feeds off uncertainty and reinforces tribal identities. The medieval fascination with astrology maps neatly onto today's obsession with horoscopes and personality quizzes, all woven into capitalist enterprises selling curated identity. And finally, the misinformation landscape of the modern wellness industry, stuffed with detoxes, miracle cures, and scientifically unproven claims, is the medieval apothecary rebranded for the digital age. The same dynamic plays out. Trust in authority is substituted with charismatic charlatans. Fear drives consumption. Knowledge is obscured by jargon and spectacle. While the stakes seem different, the underlying dynamics, power, profit, and control, fueled by fear and ignorance, remain eerily similar. Power corrupts through these same mechanisms across centuries. Secrecy and euphemism shield corruption. Spectacle and violence enforce it. Superstition and misinformation disguise it as wisdom. Humans crave order and certainty, especially when confronted by chaos and suffering, making such patterns tragically resilient. Looking back, the historical impact of these medieval hardships is profound. The intertwining of sexual repression, public violence, superstition, and pseudoscience didn't just shape an era. They seeded the societal challenges of the modern world. The Middle Ages didn't end with a polite turning of the page. Their legacy bleeds into our institutions, social norms, and knowledge systems. The Church's confluence with scientific dogma set a precedent for gatekeeping knowledge that has echoed into censorship and anti-intellectualism today. Public spectacles of violence evolved into modern state-sanctioned punishments, surveillance, and control mechanisms. Attitudes towards sexuality, steeped in shame and euphemism, cast long shadows over contemporary social mores, contributing to ongoing stigma and misinformation. Moreover, the alchemists' blend of science and superstition laid the groundwork for both modern science and its shadowy twins, quackery and pseudoscience. The Renaissance and Enlightenment eventually broke many medieval chains, but the skeletons of ignorance and fear remain in societal closets. The political and social systems built on manipulation, fear, and spectacle continue to challenge notions of justice and human dignity. Perhaps the most perverse lesson of all is this: medieval civilization didn't fall because foreign enemies were stronger or more organized. It collapsed because absolute power transformed every institution into a theater of corruption. The secretive bedrooms of nobles and peasants, the blood-soaked battlefields and public squares, the superstitious homes and ritualistic laboratories, all became stages for the same performance, the systematic conversion of vice into virtue through the alchemy of power, fear, and propaganda. And if you think this is just ancient history, well, look around. The costumes have changed, but the play remains the same. Civilization then as now is less a monument to human triumph and more a fragile dollhouse, balanced atop a foundation of hypocrisy, violence, superstition, and self-delusion. We tell stories of knights and kings, plagues and philosophers, but the real saga is the dance of power corrupting everything it touches, dressing cruelty in ceremony, ignorance in wisdom, and fear in faith. At its heart, the medieval nightmare exposes a truth about human nature that refuses to age gracefully. Where there is power, there lurks the shadow of corruption, and where there is fear, the human mind flirts dangerously with superstition and false hope. This cycle traps societies in prisons not always visible, hidden behind euphemisms, rituals, and spectacles, as real as any castle wall. So as you sit back, perhaps amused or horrified by these boring tales of centuries past, remember that the Middle Ages didn't vanish so much as they evolved. Every age has its hidden passions and dark spectacles, its rituals of power and its theatre of lies. And in understanding this, maybe we inch closer to recognizing the play for what it truly is. Sweet dreams, dear listener. And remember, this is just the stuff that